Good morning. I'm Jason Marzak, Director of the Atlantic Council's Adrian Arch Latin America Center, and thank you for joining us for this important discussion in partnership with our Geoeconomic Center on the importance of strengthening critical supply chains and the role of the Western Hemisphere. I'm delighted to welcome Congressman Adam Kinzinger, Congressman Jason Crow, who are co-sponsors of the Made in the Americas Act, which was introduced in the House of Representatives about 2 weeks ago. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us today. I'd also like to acknowledge Adrian Arch, Atlantic Council Executive Vice Chair and founder of the Adrian Arch Latin America Center, as well as the Adrian Arch Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center, who's joining today's conversation. Adrian is a champion as well of finding opportunities to strengthen hemispheric prosperity at such a pivotal moment. Today's conversation is critical to our shared goals of prosperity and security in the Western Hemisphere and how we can rebuild smarter and more prosperous from COVID-19. The global disruption caused by the pandemic has affected the supply chains of nearly all Fortune 1000 companies, exposing critical vulnerabilities in the U.S. economy, and especially in areas critical to U.S. national security interests. We've talked about nearshoring and reshoring, but what is also gaining traction is ally shoring. In today's discussion, we'll dig deep into the opportunities this can bring for the United States, while also helping to advance the economic reactivation of democracies in Latin America and the Caribbean, one of the regions hardest hit by COVID, and countries that continue to reel from the effects of the pandemic. Post-COVID prosperity for our hemisphere is an issue that we have deeply focused on, releasing this past spring a partnership strategy for the Biden administration on how to accelerate the region's COVID recovery, which includes the opportunity to double down to advance commercial integration. As we'll discuss today, with geographic proximity, existing workforce and infrastructure capabilities, and strong commercial ties to the United States, Latin America and the Caribbean is a strategic and well-positioned partner for manufacturing hubs and supply chains of products essential to U.S. security interests. As well, similar time zones, tied to the 60 million plus U.S. Latinos, and proximity to domestic and regional markets are some of the key assets that this partnership stands to gain from. I'd like to now introduce the congressmen who will discuss their bill and the underlying concepts behind it today. Congressman Adam Kinzinger is currently serving his sixth term, representing Illinois' 16th congressional district, which stretches across 14 counties in northern Illinois. The congressman is a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, as well as the House Committee on Energy and Commerce. And before being elected to Congress, he served in the Air Force in both Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom. Congressman Jason Crow is in his second term, representing Colorado's 6th congressional district, which includes the eastern portion of Denver's metropolitan area, as well as parts of the southern metro area. He's a former U.S. Army Ranger who served 3 tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan. And upon return to Colorado, he was named as Denver's pro bono Lawyer of the Year for his work helping service members transition from military to civilian life. I'm delighted that my colleague Julia Freelander, she's a C. Boyd and Gray Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomic Center, will moderate the conversation today. Julia previously served in various positions in the U.S. government, including in the Treasury Department, the White House, and the CIA. With that, Julia, the floor is over to you.
Thank you so much, Jason. And Congressman, let me extend my personal welcome to you for joining us today at the Atlantic Council and for taking the time to discuss this very interesting new piece of legislation. Congratulations for launching it and bringing it to the floor. To open up the conversation, I might just ask both of you, just for a starter, where does this come from? What is the impetus behind introducing the bill at this time? I know you've been working on it for a while. Perhaps, Congressman Kinzinger, we can start with you.
Yeah, thanks to the Atlantic Council for doing this, and to my friend Jason, for working with me on this. It's a fantastic partnership, and look, where does it come from? It's a realization of where we were 14 months ago. When COVID hit, and we recognized not just some of the threats that were made, against things like PPE, but just in particular what concentrated supply chains in areas that you never know what can happen. You never know what can go down. You never know what politics can be used. And the realization that we've got to protect a lot of that. I mean, there's no way to completely decouple, right, from nations that can potentially use trade as a weapon in theory. But most importantly is how do we get that back to the United States or nearshore it. And by the way, I just got back yesterday from El Salvador. My wife is Salvadorian, and going down there and seeing the complete need for economic investment, the hardworking Salvadorian people, areas like kind of the free trade zones that exist. And you recognize this is not just good for the United States, but it's also good for the region. So I think that's where the inception of it came from. But the bottom line is the recognition that we had to do something because that some of those vulnerabilities were exposed.
Thank you. And Congressman Crow, I know you're the co-sponsor. How did you come about this? And what do you see as some of the strongest selling points of the legislation?
Yeah, thanks, Julia. And I want to start by thanking the Atlantic Council Latin America Center and particularly Adam for putting this on, hosting it. I have to give a lot of credit to Adam here as somebody who really came up with this idea and concept that built it out into the legislation that it is, and then worked with our office to smooth it into the current version. So really a great opportunity to work with my friend and legislative partner, Adam, on this bill. Listen, this comes from, as Adam said, the realization that there are a couple of major challenges that our country faces right now. The first is a rising China that wants to rewrite the rules that have served the world so well in the post-World War II era, from a rules-based international order to an international order that's dominated by autocracy. And they are very aggressively pursuing an predatory economic agenda to do that. And I think we've all woken up recently in the last couple of years to this notion that so much of our supply chain, so much of our economy is tied up within the Chinese sphere of influence. And it's not just been COVID that has shown that, but we've seen that in other contexts as well. And I sit on the Armed Services Committee, the Intelligence Committee, and the Small Business Committee. And what I love so much about this effort is it actually addresses so many of the things that we deal with on each of those committees. And I just mentioned the national security issue, which really takes two forms. One is contested logistics, this idea that a conflict or even a pre-conflict or a low-grade conflict would involve largely a contested logistical supply chains. That conflict would look very different from what we're used to in the 20th century. And you don't have to have ships and planes battling each other if we just shut off the economy, or our adversaries try to shut off our economy and our supply chain and so much of what makes daily American life move. The second piece is the actual hardware itself. I am doing an initiative right now called the Sustainable Power Initiative to try to make our military installations around the world more resilient to climate change and more resilient to extreme weather and cyber attack, as we've seen as a major issue. And one of the biggest problems that we're facing right now is the actual technology, the hardware, whether it be power meters, gauges, microgrids, the things that actually we have to install, the infrastructure itself is manufactured in so many cases in China or in areas adjacent to China. And they can put back doors into that technology that are extremely dangerous to us. And the last piece is just the small business development, a recognition that we have to revitalize the American economy. We have to re-onshore our manufacturing. I go around my community all the time and talk to small businesses, and the single biggest issue they have right now is workforce. They just don't have the workforce to do the work that's necessary, even if they have the opportunity to do that work. So this is really going to help catalyze the development of a 21st century workforce and help that re-onshoring and bring it back to the Western Hemisphere.
Thank you so much. And I think both of you have highlighted what with the Atlantic Council and our Geoeconomic Center also focus on, really the nexus between economics, trade, and national security. So I wonder if I could ask each of you to say a little bit more about the link between trade and national security. Again, building off of your respective military backgrounds, I think that might be very, very interesting for our audience, again, because we're seeing a lot of discussions, both in the administration and on the congressional side right now, that tie up many areas of operation in ways that they perhaps haven't been for a little while.
Well, look, I think go back to the old belief and the old understanding that at no point have free trade partners ever fought in a war. Okay. Now, this isn't a free trade agreement, but it's an understanding that when you have close national links to each other, it makes combat much less likely. It makes looking for solutions to problems much more likely because you have a vested interest in it. But let's look at the national security side a little deeper when it comes to within a country. So let's say you're in an area that is unstable economically. That is an area where you are prone to radicalization potentially because you're desperate. When you don't have comfort, you go to the very base of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Which is just, how do we provide security? And somebody that's an authoritarian comes along and says, I'm going to keep you safe. But when you give people hope and opportunity and you give them economic prosperity, that's when you get to self-actualization. And that's when people can become entrepreneurs and create something in their own country. Look at the emergency we have on the southern border. And I'm not saying that from an immigration perspective. I'm saying it from a cartels using human trafficking to make a ton of money, putting people in a bad situation because of the desperation to get to somewhere with economic opportunity. If you give economic opportunity, for instance, to the Northern Triangle countries, it makes, it alleviates that issue. And then you also look at things like energy, for instance. Now, Jason and I are generally probably on the same when it comes to energy, too. And you look at the fact that, okay, when you talk about the exportation of natural gas from the United States, for instance, to Europe, or helping Europe develop their own green or energy infrastructure, no matter what that is, because we recognize that Russia uses energy as a soft power weapon. So that's where trade is very important as well, is having that where you're not reliant on, in some cases, somebody that can use that trade as a weapon. So look at the case of China. We know that 14 months ago, China basically threatened to cut off PPE. They even said publicly that if we made any kind of an accusation of China for, the origins of the coronavirus or something, that we would drown in a sea of COVID. So a lot of times we take heat for anything we say about the Chinese Communist Party. They said the US would drown in a sea of COVID. So I think that is where it's important to recognize that national security link. When you have peace, when you have prosperity, I guess when you have prosperity, you're much more likely to have peace and much less likely to have war and more security.
Yeah, just picking up where Adam left off, I think there's this broader recognition that conflict looks very different in the 21st century and going forward than it looked like in the 20th century. What is extremely unlikely is having to meet, hordes of tanks on the plains of Eastern Europe, which was largely the type of conflict that we prepared for in the 20th century. It's going to involve, the current conflicts are going to involve space, they're going to involve telecommunications, it's going to involve contested logistics. You just look at the last 6 months, what's happened the last 6 months from the solar winds hack, which had the possibility of disrupting our economy in a far, far more substantial way than it did. We frankly got very lucky that we identified that and were able to patch those holes because it impacted over 17,000 different financial institutions, businesses, and even our government agencies. You look at the Colonial Pipeline hack, which was largely a non-state actor attack, a ransomware attack. It happened again this past weekend with JBS, which shut down its trucking operations as a result of a ransomware attack. This is going to happen more and more as time goes forward. And frankly, there are vulnerabilities that we don't even know of yet. People that have backdoors into our systems that haven't been made public or that we haven't been able to determine has happened yet. So we're far more vulnerable than people think. So this connection between our economy and national security, I think people are starting to recognize in a really real way. And hardware is a big part of this. I mentioned earlier this connection between microprocessors, the actual technology and the infrastructure that we need to convert to a clean energy economy, to address climate change, to build up more resilient military installations, to make sure that our defense industrial base, which is actually largely private, that's another thing that distinguishes ourselves from many of our adversaries that have government run and controlled defense industrial bases. The United States does not. We rely on an entire ecosystem of private companies to support our troops, our military, to supply us, and that's a very big difference between us and our allies. So making sure that industrial base is secure, which is an economic issue in so many ways and a technological one, is extremely important to what this bill is about.
Thank you so much. You've really highlighted some crucial issues that we're dealing with right now and that are really on the plate for across the government, and we're handling here at the Atlantic Council as well. Representative Kinzinger, maybe I could turn back to you and ask specifically about the Western Hemisphere, about Latin America. Why does this bill recommend that supply chains be relocated here? What advantages does that offer the United States?
So I think it's a couple things, having both, obviously near-term geographic is important in terms of less vulnerability on shipping lines, for an example. I think things like understanding even similar time zones mesh as well. But most importantly, because they're our friends, they're our neighbor, it's our hemisphere. For so long, Central, South America, et cetera, has been neglected, I think, by the United States in favor of, whether it's the Middle East or whether it's, China, Asia, focus, stuff like that. It's the understanding that there have been authoritarian movements in our hemisphere. Just look at Venezuela. The understanding that China has actually, in fact, not begun to invest for a significant amount of time, has been investing in our Western Hemisphere and trying to replace us as leaders. There's a number of countries you can point to where China has basically walked in and said, look, if the US abandons you, don't worry, we're going to be here for you. And we won't have all these humanitarian rules surrounding, our assistance. So I think you can see that the importance of that, as well as just the development economically. But I think most important is just the realization that when you have supply chain vulnerabilities, the closer it can be to you geographically, whether it's an issue of a war, whether it's an issue of a pandemic, is always better. And so you think about the complication of that. So this creates a manufacturing resiliency council whose main job it is to find these vulnerabilities, to implement these incentives to relocate these supply chains here. But it is really deep. There's no, Xanax mine, for an example, right? You have all these different parts of drugs that go into compounding. So you have to figure out what is it that really is vulnerable? How do we protect that here? And what is possible? So I think having it in our hemisphere is good for us, both from a defense perspective, both from a protected secure supply chain perspective, but just as importantly as an economic development perspective for our near neighbors.
Thank you, and I'll keep the Xanax mine in mind next time for my next conversation. So maybe I could ask you a little more about what incentives the bill might offer to bring these businesses home, to affect nearshoring or ally shoring, I think, as Jason alluded to in his introduction.
Yeah, so it's first off, it creates this resiliency council. So I consider it somewhat similar to National Security Council. You have different heads of agencies coming together, find out what are the security threats, how do we use whole of government efforts. So similar to that. And they can say, let's say, for instance, they find product A that is essential to national security or is a critical it's a critical item. It's either all super concentrated in one area or it's something that we have to make sure we have production of here. Well, what it does is it allows, the priority is the United States of America. So it allows 100% expensing for moving to the United States of America. But we have to recognize too, I think realistically, we could demagogue the issue and it's not going to go anywhere. We have to recognize that there are some industries or some manufacturing that simply cannot afford to come back to the United States. That's when they would pick the Central America route, for instance, south, like our hemisphere, and then they get a 60% expensing for relocation. And then you create a production tax credit. So 30% if you're in the United States, 15% if you're an identified industry in the near shore. So again, the incentives are front loaded to say United States of America, but there is an understanding that's not always going to be the case. And then within that zone of the Western Hemisphere, those goods can be sold or transferred in essence, free of export charges and fees. So we think it's a great way to go, to be able to begin this issue of defending our supply chains. And I think it has a great opportunity to come along.
Thank you. And Congressman Crow, maybe I'll turn to you for additional thoughts on that, but maybe also how this fits into to USMCA and existing trade arrangements that we have in the hemisphere, particularly with Canada and Mexico.
Yeah, absolutely. As Adam said, the incentives are heavily weighted towards bringing them back to the United States, but this is a realistic bill also. It's one based on the reality, and the reality is the size of the supply chain and the amount of manufacturing exceeds currently the U.S. capacity to do that. And we know that we don't have a lot of time here. There's an urgency to this that's also driving the very pragmatic structure of this bill. So we want to bring as much back to the United States as possible, but we know there are limitations to doing so, and we know we don't even have the size to meet the magnitude of that supply chain. So why not bring it and focus it on our Western Hemisphere partners? I represent one of the most diverse districts in America. I have over 160 languages spoken in my public school district here in Colorado. 20% of my constituents were born outside of America. So I think the cultural ties and just the human ties that we have to Mexico, to Central America, to South America, and Canada are extremely important here. I have a lot of constituents from El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, who are business owners, family members. They constantly travel back and forth between their home countries and their current home. So we have these cultural ties and these human ties that I think will be really helpful in making this transition fast, and which we can both benefit from. I'm also a big proponent of making sure that we address the root causes of our immigration problems. And as Adam said earlier, we have for far too long neglected our own backyard, Central America and South America. And we see the consequences of that neglect. It's time that we make sure that we're engaging and investing back home and in our own backyard, because it's going to be far cheaper for us in the long run. It's going to be beneficial for everybody. It'll help communities like mine that have deep ties and histories tied to Central and South America. And it will also help our national security. Then the last piece, the tie between the infrastructure we have already in place. We have, as you said, USMCA, other agreements. We don't have to reinvent the wheel here. We have an agreement that I think will serve as a really good structure to help us do this and do it in the right way. I'm a firm believer in organized labor in America and environmental standards. We have the USMCA that set that basic floor to make sure that as we re-onshore this and we build out this advanced manufacturing and the supply chain that we have to have in the future, that we do so in a way that's consistent with our environmental ethics and also our ethics in terms of how we treat people in supporting labor in the process.
I got to add just one quick point that I forgot to mention is, the countries that can benefit from this are not like Nicaragua or, Venezuela, where there is authoritarian regimes. It has to be a country committed to democracy. So you think about the incentive of that as well. If you tend towards authoritarianism, or there's a movement towards it, and you've been benefiting from this kind of friendly, safe countries kind of agreement, your trend out of democracy may be much more costly than it would seem.
That was actually the question I was going to ask you, was about regional stability. We have a question coming in about making the Northern Triangle region more invested in its people and strengthening its private sector. So maybe I could just ask you to be a little bit more specific. Which countries do you think will benefit the most from this, or we will benefit most from a closer connection to?
Well, look, I think there's no doubt Central America, right? Any of the countries such as, but you think specifically the Northern Triangle with the issue with migration right now, they would benefit substantially by strong economic development and security that would come with this. We would benefit from a much more stable situation at the border, plus a much more, I guess, kind of friendly area. You're dealing with China really trying to usurp the United States there, because they can again walk in and say, look, if you want to be an authoritarian, that's great. We don't care. We may actually prefer it, and we're going to give you the same money as the United States. We look at the challenges in El Salvador, for instance. Again, my wife is Salvadorian. You see the president of El Salvador recently, in essence, fired the Supreme Court based on just winning power in the Congress. So those are concerns to us. And while obviously there's, limited things the United States can do, and there's a lot of things we can do and should do among that, one of those things is to say, look, we're not imposing the United States will on anybody, but if you want to be an economic partner with us, this is the case. Here's some incentives that come with it. Not everything's a carrot. But again, I think if you look at those areas, you look at, for instance, Nicaragua, which today would not qualify, but, in the future, you can see how there would be a desire and a demand for economic development and a desire and a demand for democracy, Venezuela, et cetera. I just think it's also the U.S. reshowing its commitment to our hemisphere, which for decades we basically forgot was even here.
Yeah, we're in a period now, last decade, a little over the last decade, we're in what Samantha Power calls a democratic recession, right? So for almost 70 years after World War II, democracy was increasing, it was expanding and spreading. And I think we had this sense that democracy is inevitable, that it's kind of the natural human condition, and people would move towards it if just given the opportunity, and it would expand and continue to expand. But we're actually seeing now that that's not happening, right? That it's being called into question, that the challenges of modern societies and the challenges the world faces in the 21st century are calling into question, these assumptions that we've just made for 70 years. So our bet is different from China's bet. China believes, and President Biden has spoken about this, others have spoken about this, they believe that their system, that autocracy is the only system that can meet the challenges of the 21st century. We obviously believe differently, that democracy is strong, is relevant, is the model that needs to continue. But to do that, we have to provide that alternative to so many countries, because what we see is there's a lot of countries that are on the fence right now. They could go one way or the other. The question is, what sphere of influence are they going to fall into? And I remember I went on the bipartisan congressional delegation to the Munich Security Conference in 2019, and we made a big push. The group of us, Democrats and Republicans, were making a big push in Europe about 5G, trying to counter Huawei and make the case that Germany and other countries should, refute or push back and not allow Huawei to come into their systems. And they said, listen, we understand what you're saying, we hear you, but what's the alternative? You're giving us no alternative here, because you don't have another option, and you can't combat something with nothing, right? So that's what we see now in Central and South America, in our own hemisphere, where China is expanding with Belt and Road, developing deep water ports, making economic investments in a variety of Central and South American countries, as they are in Africa and throughout Asia. We can't combat something with nothing. So this is our alternative. This is where we can come up and say, you can have a strong economy, but a strong economy is also tied to anti-corruption measures. It's also tied to transparency. It's also tied to democratic forms of governance, that you can't have one without the other, but we are providing that alternative for you to come and join us to start expanding democracy again. And this is such an important part of that effort.
By the way, to all my friends on the right, the far right, that I'm pretty, not super in close with right now, I want to remind them, when they use China as a battering ram in the political realm of things, you can't be both a China hawk and somebody that wants to withdraw from the world and let it all burn, like some of them say. So you either compete with China and you have to modernize your immigration system, strengthen your supply chains, or you don't compete with China, put up the walls, act like the rest of the world doesn't exist, but don't be ticked off when they exceed our capabilities in the future.
I'm going to let that stand. Here at the Atlantic Council, we are working hard to help delineate the lines between national security and economic policy, global democratic engagement, while also respecting American values and upholding them. I'd like to thank you, gentlemen, both for joining us today for this exciting conversation. We'll be tracking the progress of the Made in Americas Act, and congratulations once again on its introduction. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.